All right, let's go back to our story on the recent school shooting in the U.S. and get some analysis on U.S. gun laws from Susan Sullivan, who is a professor of law and politics at Temple University, and she joins us now live from Philadelphia. Thank you so much for joining us here on the NewsHour. Now, I want to start off by talking about what Ethan Crumbley has been charged with. He has been charged as an adult. He faces charges on murder, assault, and weapons, along with one count of terrorism. What do you make of how the justice system has handled this case compared to other similar cases?
Well, Afnan, it's very early in the process. Of course, they're still investigating. There is indication that this young man had been posting comments on social media, so the police are investigating that. I think what people are surprised by, although I think it's understandable, is this charge of terrorism. We usually think of terrorism as something often international by an organized group. Terrorism isn't really the act. Terrorism is the effect. Terrorism is making people afraid, instilling terror. And you do that extremely effectively when you use children as the victims, when you have a child, a 15-year-old, who is carrying out the terrorist act, the violent act, in an environment that is supposed to be safe. So, yes, intentional murder. There's a lot of information that the police are looking at that suggests he had been planning this, that it was premeditated, hence the murder charge. Terrorism is an unusual charge, but I think a perfectly understandable one in these circumstances.
Professor, there have been 29 school shootings this year alone, and despite that, only half of U.S. adults favor stricter laws there. Is that why the U.S. is facing this problem more than any other country?
Well, I think it's even bigger than that. The American psyche is ingrained with this idea of a right to hold guns, a right to have protection. There are more guns in this country than there are people, which in and of itself, in a country that doesn't have any kind of military service requirement, is staggering. So it's all part of that American psyche. And I think it's important, too, when we look at the numbers, that we tend to focus on mass shootings, which are typically shootings with more than 3 or 4 victims, more than 3 or 4 deaths. There have been over 100 shootings at different American schools. Luckily, they've not all involved so many victims. And there are also hundreds and hundreds of children and others who are injured. Again, we focus on the gun deaths. A gun injury, a gun shot, when you're a victim of a gun attack, that can be a life-changing experience, either physically or psychologically.
Right, and I'm really short on time, Professor, but I want to squeeze in one last question. Do you think the U.S. will bring in more stricter measures when it comes to gun sales?
I have to say no. I think there may be some restrictions. There could be some relatively straightforward regulations, but not only is this so culturally ingrained, but there are legal, constitutional protections, barriers that will prevent the government from enacting restrictive laws. I think this is an ongoing problem and will continue to be for a long time.
All right, Professor Susan Sullivan. She's a professor of law and politics at Temple University from Philadelphia. Thank you so much for joining us here on the NewsHour. It's a pleasure having you.